Good morning, Dennis.
I was just gonna say quickly, please keep your cameras on when the lectures are going on, everyone.
Yeah, it would be helpful if everybody keeps their camera on. It kind of creates a better sense of community.
Well, you all look gorgeous this morning, so there you go. I've had my say.
It's an app. It's an airbrush app. Okay, so I think we will start. So welcome back, everybody. I hope you had a good evening. So we have two wonderful presentations this afternoon in this session. We have Professor Irwin Cotler. Irwin is the Raoul Wallenberg Chair, which is a Center for Human Rights. He's also an Emeritus Professor of Law and Human Rights at McGill University, and is the former Minister of Justice and Attorney General of Canada, and for many decades a leading voice on issues of not only human rights but fighting various forms of anti-Semitism. So it's a privilege that Irwin is with us. And we also have Professor Aleksandra, who's now in Florence. She's finishing off a fellowship there. And Alex is also assistant professor at the Institute of Law Studies in Poland, in the Polish Academy of Sciences in Warsaw. And I've had the privilege of working with Alex for many years. She was a research fellow at ISA about 10 years ago, and is really at the forefront of the struggle against anti-Semitism in Poland and internationally. And she'll tell you, I'm sure, much about her work. Irwin will start off. Irwin will be the first speaker, and the title of his lecture is A Domestic and International Action Plan for Combating Anti-Semitism. And Alex's lecture is entitled Anti-Semitism and the Capture of the Human Rights Discourse. So Irwin, the floor is yours, and each speaker will speak for roughly 20 minutes, and then we'll have a Q&A session. So thank you.
Thank you, Charles. May I begin by commending you and ISGAP for organizing yet another exemplary institute. And I'm delighted to be joining Alex this morning. She is as well a senior fellow of our Raoul Wallenberg Center for Human Rights, and I have followed her exemplary contributions since actually meeting her some 10 years ago, as you referenced. As we meet, we are witnessing an old, new, escalating, global, virulent, sophisticated, and even lethal anti-Semitism, grounded in classical anti-Semitism, but distinguishable from it, that first found international juridical expression in the UN Zionism is Racism resolution, which the late Daniel Moynihan said, and properly so, gave the abomination of anti-Semitism the appearance of international legal sanction, but which has gone dramatically beyond that, and which reached its first international tipping point in the Durban conference in 2001. May I say that when I first heard about the Durban conference in 1997, I greeted it with anticipation, if not excitement. This was to be the first World Conference Against Racism of the 21st century. This was to be the first International Human Rights Conference of the 21st century, and was to take place in Durban, South Africa, the birthplace of apartheid, and where, as someone who had been involved in the struggle against apartheid, I had been arrested there in 1981. But what happened at Durban was, if I may use an oft-abused metaphor, was truly Orwellian. A world conference against racism was turned into a conference of racism against Israel and the Jewish people. The first International Human Rights Conference singled out one state and one people for selective opprobrium and indictment. A conference to commend the dismantling of South African apartheid became a conference calling for the dismantling of Israel as an apartheid state. Indeed, I can still hear, I can still see the chanting, the marches in the streets, and the chanting which said that the struggle against apartheid in the 20th century required the dismantling of South Africa as an apartheid state, and the struggle against apartheid in the 21st century requires the dismantling of Israel as an apartheid state. On September 10th, I flew back to Canada. On September 11th, we witnessed 9/11. And as one of my colleagues put it at the time, if 9/11 was the Kristallnacht of terror, then Durban was its Mein Kampf. And so Durban became the launching pad for the institutionalization, internationalization, instrumentalization of the new anti-Semitism, as I wrote at the time in the aftermath of Durban. If classical anti-Semitism would see the Jew as the enemy of all that is good and the embodiment of all that is evil, the new anti-Semitism now saw the Jew and the Jewish state as the enemy of all that is good and the embodiment of all that was evil, which found expression in what I referred to then as a demonizing anti-Semitism, a demonizing anti-Semitism where the Jewish state was indicted as a racist, imperialist, colonialist, ethnic cleansing, child murdering, apartheid, Nazi state. And where Durban itself became the launching pad for the laundering of anti-Semitism under universal public values, under the protective cover of the United Nations, under the authority of international law, under the culture of human rights, and under the very struggle against racism itself. And so Durban metastasized, the legacy of Durban metastasized into a second tipping point on the occasion of the Hamas war against Israel, where we are witnessing, as we meet and have been witnessing since that Hamas war, of Jews being targeted and threatened in their neighborhoods and in the streets, on the campuses and in the communities, where synagogues are torched, memorials are defaced, institutions are vandalized, and cemeteries are desecrated. The whole reaching dramatic expression in three dramatic developments. The first was the exponential increase in anti-Semitic hate crimes, where if 2020 saw record and alarming increases in anti-Semitic hate crimes in Canada, the US, Europe, and elsewhere, by May 2021, we had reached already the levels of the whole of 2020, which, as I said, was itself the highest year for anti-Semitic hate crimes, in particular here in Canada. The second thing was an exponential and indeed explosive increase in incendiary anti-Semitism on the social media, dramatized, among other examples, by the very fact that in 1 week in May, you had 17,000 tweets on the variation that Hitler was right. And just recently, a study released by Professor Gabriel Weinman of Haifa University, examining the explosive nature of anti-Semitic incitement on the social media, showed that there had been a 912% increase in 1 year in anti-Semitic hate speech on TikTok, which has at this point 1.4 billion users, and where over 40% of them are between the ages of 16 and 25. And the third development was what I would call the normalization of this demonological anti-Semitism. Indeed, what is so disturbing is that this old, new, escalating, global, virulent, sophisticated, and lethal anti-Semitism is now underpinned by a series of dynamics that are not sufficiently appreciated, but which frame the backdrop for the action plan that I want to initiate very shortly. First is what I would call the mainstreaming, the normalization, the legitimation of anti-Semitism in the political culture, and the absence of outrage underscored by the indifference and inaction in relation to it. The second is the globalization of anti-Semitism. Jews are a global people. What happens in London and Paris reverberates in Montreal and Toronto and elsewhere, and has been replicated in the globalization phenomenon, where convoys march through the streets of London in the United Kingdom saying, F the Jews will rape your daughters. Similar convoys march through streets in Canada saying the same thing. And so the reverberation and replication of this anti-Semitism as a global phenomenon. The third was the marginalization of anti-Semitism in the struggle against racism. We need to be engaged in all aspects of systemic racism, where be it racism against Indigenous people, against Blacks or people of color, against Muslims, against Asian Canadians and the like. But what we have been witnessing has been the fact that anti-Semitism has been marginalized in that necessary overall struggle against racism itself, and where education and training programs, both within and without governments, marginalize or even exclude anti-Semitism as part of anti-racism training. The fourth is the laundering of anti-Semitism under the very cover of the struggle against racism itself, where Jews are referred to as the white oppressor, if not supremacist group, and Israel is referred to as the oppressor, victimizer group. In other words, the appropriation of the whole intersectional discourse with respect to the delegitimization and demonization of both Jews and the Jewish state. And the final thing has been the revival of classical anti-Semitic tropes of the Jews as the poisoner of the wells, which in COVID-19 converged with Jews, the Jewish people, and the Jewish state being accused of manufacturing the COVID-19 virus, of causing its spread, of profiting from it, and even on the social media itself being defined as being the actual virus itself. And so at this point, the question becomes, what then do we do? May I summarize the action to be taken in a number of one-liners for reasons of time? And I want to draw upon the first ever urgent national summit on anti-Semitism, which was convened 2 weeks ago in Canada by the Canadian government, under the leadership of and with the participation of the Prime Minister of Canada, 10 government ministers, parliamentarians from across the spectrum, leaders of civil society, and a diverse representation from the Jewish community and Jewish community leadership. And I want to just identify 2 witness testimonies of the lived experience that was shared because of the impact that they had on the Prime Minister and the ministers present. The first was testimony by students who described how they were being marginalized, bullied, excluded in the campus culture, being forced effectively to choose between their Jewish identity and acceptance in the social justice, campus intersectionist discourse, and the like. The second were Black Jewish women who described, in effect, they embodied, if you will, intersectionality, but who described how they were targeted not only for being women and being Black, but for being Jewish, and where the targeting of being Jewish was the worst of the targeted of the intersectionalities in that regard. And which I think evoked the response from the Prime Minister, who in response to the lived experiences and witness testimonies said that combating the 3 Ds, the demonization of Israel, the delegitimization of Israel, and the double standard will be a priority for the government, just as combating BDS remains a priority, and that Canada will take a lead with respect to combating anti-Semitism, both domestically and globally. And so the question then is, if it is to be a priority for us, for the Canadian government, how does it find expression? What is the national action plan, in effect, the global action plans that need to be adopted and implemented? Number one, I would recommend that other countries be encouraged to hold similar national summits and to develop national action plans to combat anti-Semitism. And ISGAP can play a role in that regard. Second, in mid-October, Sweden will be holding the 20th anniversary conference to commend the Stockholm Declaration, which led to the adoption of IRA itself, and where countries participating in that conference are to come there with demonstrable pledges for the combating of anti-Semitism. Here too, we can encourage countries not only to attend, because they are to attend through their leadership, prime ministers, presidents, and the like, but to come armed with pledges to be implemented to combat anti-Semitism. Number three, we need to enhance the adoption and implementation of the IRA working definition on anti-Semitism, which is not only the most authoritative, comprehensive, and international definition that we have, but what is often ignored, if it in fact is even known, is the most representative, one that was democratically adopted during a 15-year process. And as someone who was present in that adoption process, both as a member of parliament and a minister of justice, I could attest to the democratic character of that adoption by intergovernmental bodies, governments, parliaments, civil society leaders, academics, and the like. And that's why I say it is the most representative definition that we have. Number four, we have to mandate Holocaust education and education about anti-Semitism in the elementary schools, and ensure that education about anti-Semitism is itself not marginalized, as I said, neither in government programs or in educational training institutes. And here I want to commend ISGAP for its work in that regard. Let there be no mistake about it. If the Holocaust is a metaphor for radical evil, then anti-Semitism is a metaphor for radical hate. Number five, we need to combat, as I said, the alarming rise in anti-Semitic hate crimes through the adoption, as was mentioned at the Canadian Summit, of the 4 Ps. By the 4 Ps, I mean the prevention of such crimes to begin with, the protection of the victims, the prosecution of the perpetrators, and partnerships between the federal, provincial, municipal authorities, in other words, all strands of government and administration. Number 6, we need to combat the exploding incendiary anti-Semitism in the social media. We talk a lot about the need for a rules-based international order. Well, the social media has been a rules-free order. And we at this point need to commit ourselves not only in a declaratory way, but as a matter of policy, legislation, and implementation to combating this incendiary anti-Semitism in the social media. And I'm pleased that the Canadian government not only made a pledge in that regard, but has in fact instituted legislation for that purpose. Number 7, we need to emphasize, as Ahmed Shahid has done, that anti-Semitism is toxic to democracies, that it is an assault on our common humanity, that it is the canary in the mineshaft of global evil, as we've often said, too often and too painfully, that while it begins with Jews, it doesn't end with Jews. And so it not only must be combated, this global anti-Semitism, as a matter of justice and necessity, but it is in fact in the self-interest of the democracies and the international communities that this does not metastasize, because as I said, while it begins with the Jews, it doesn't end with the Jews. Number 8, there must be a zero tolerance policy for anti-Semitism amongst our political leaders and political parties. This means calling out anti-Semitism, not just in the other's political party, but calling it out in our own political parties, and not allowing anti-Semitism to be weaponized or instrumentalized for partisan and political purposes. And finally, and most directly related, not only to the Durban legacy, but to the most recent tipping point with the Hamas war against Israel, we must unmask, expose, and combat the laundering of anti-Semitism under universal public values, under the protective cover of the United Nations, under the authority of international law, under the culture of human rights, and under the very struggles, I said, of anti-racism itself. And let there be no mistake about it. This is not just prejudicial to Israel and to the Jewish people, though that would be reason enough if you single out one people and one state for selective opprobrium and indictment. What has to be realized is that this laundering of anti-Semitism is eroding the authority of the United Nations, is undermining the integrity of international law, is corrupting the culture of human rights, is defaming and demeaning the real struggle against the real racism as it shames and demeans the real struggle as it was against the real apartheid. In a word, we need to organize a global constituency of conscience, a global constituency of conscience to combat this global anti-Semitism. And in this global constituency of conscience, we need not only to condemn, we need to act. We need to implement, as I said, a national and international action plan. And we must therefore now begin to not only speak up and stand up against this insidious domestic and global anti-Semitism, but we must act, for this is a threat to our common humanity. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Irwin, for your insights and wisdom and leadership on these issues. Thank you very much for presenting. So next is Alex, and she will present, and then we'll have a Q&A with both Irwin and Alex afterwards. So Alex, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you, Charles. Well, speaking after Professor Cotler is such a challenge, but also a great honor. And it's also a great honor to be invited by ISGAP again. And I'm very, very grateful for this. Actually, everything what I'm doing now in the field of fighting anti-Semitism and what I have been doing for the last 10 years started with Yale and Charles. And for this, I'm also extremely grateful. It has been a long and difficult way, but I can say it's worth it. If I may say so, after 10 years of being involved in our common cause and this struggle, this fight that is getting more and more dramatic, as we have heard from Professor Cotler. It's really striking how anti-Semitism is not being fighted, what we all hoped for the last years, but it's actually getting worse and more intense all around the world. And normally I'm presenting on Poland, or as some in Poland want, I defame my home country. And for this, I can be sued for the defamation of the good name of Poland and Poles. So today, I will refrain myself from defaming Poland, perhaps just with some minor examples during my presentation coming from Poland. But I wanted to say that most of the elements, Professor Cotler, that you mentioned for these national action plans that would need to be organized and conducted are actually impossible in countries like mine, in Poland right now. I would even say none of these elements could be implemented effectively and truthfully, which is another challenge, I think, because Canada, as we know, is a champion of human rights in all respects. And perhaps there are some more countries like Canada, but we also have to remember that there are countries and governments that will stand absolutely against this, what I agree just needs to be done when we want to take this fight against anti-Semitism seriously. So today I will speak about the phenomenon, highly dangerous phenomenon that Professor Cotler also addressed, of actually capturing and taking over the very concept of human rights by those who actually don't want to include fighting anti-Semitism within human rights agenda. And for the last couple of years, I have noticed that this trend within academia, on this academic scholarly level, is growing rapidly. And it is not normal and usual anymore to say that when I'm dealing with human rights, I'm a human rights lawyer, I actually deal with fighting anti-Semitism. More and more scholars, more and more people are actually opposed such idea for fighting for human rights, claiming that we absolutely cannot, for example, talk about the violations of Israel, of the rights of Israelis or Jews. We cannot compare this, for example, with the fight for the rights of Palestinians. And I see a great and big challenge and problem in the very idea of actually deleting anti-Semitism from the area of human rights protection. Definitely. Can we start with the slides? Yes, thank you. Okay, so we'll get to the next one. So just as a reminder of what everyone knows, actually, that these are like basic facts concerning not only anti-Semitism, but also the history of international human rights protection in this legal sense. And we really have to remember that these are all combined elements. And one of the greatest achievements of the movement of human rights protection in the 20th century was to include fighting anti-Semitism within it. So, but it wasn't so, of course, from the very beginning, and for the most of the times, our times and the ages before, actually law was used not for protection, but for discrimination, exclusion, persecution of Jews, etc. With the Nuremberg laws of 1935 being like the lowest point of abusing law against the Jews. But this changed after the Second World War. Can we go to the next slide? When actually anti-Semitism was one of these factors, these elements that prompted a lot of actors to introduce relevant legal instruments within international human rights agenda to protect Jews from anti-Semitism and to actually implement this policy or this notion of never again, which of course we know wasn't successful at all. Well, perhaps not at all, but to a large extent. But this was also the idea standing behind the very movement of international protection of human rights. So here are two quotes from the two leaders of two major organizations that deal with the human rights protection. So from Kofi Annan in 2004 and the former Council of Europe's Deputy Secretary General that was extremely concerned about fighting anti-Semitism. And in both of these quotes, we can see how this role of fighting anti-Semitism is being underlined and stressed, and also that anti-Semitism is being combined into this general fight for human rights, which is, and here I agree with Professor Cotler fully, should be also our agenda and one of our notions, that we still talk about anti-Semitism as a part of talking about human rights and fighting racism as such in general, but with, of course, taking into account and into consideration all the challenges that surround this inclusion of anti-Semitism into general fight against racism, xenophobia, ethnic, national, religious hatred. Can we get to the next one, please? Yes, so this is a slide from Durban 2001 that Professor Cotler already addressed. So I think that this is extremely important and striking to see how it changed. Of course, it was not only this very moment of September 2001 when out of nowhere and suddenly anti-Semitism stopped being an issue within human rights agenda, and anti-Semitism just was expressed on such a great scale as it happened in Durban. But I think that this is an important point of change, or the moment of change. And from Durban 2001, from this moment on, I think it was more and more easy to exclude anti-Semitism and exclude the rights of the Jewish people to protection, also in this general discourse on human rights. So it was already from this moment on allowed not to include Jews into these groups, especially vulnerable groups that demand protection by the international human rights law. And when this narrative started, it was then much, much easier for all those who wanted to actually change these narratives about human rights to prove and to argue that fighting anti-Semitism should not be considered fighting racism and other forms of discrimination and intolerance. And I have the impression that this attitude grow in time up until now, when it's actually, as I said, in the international legal, also academia, just a normal thing to claim that that when we talk about human rights, we do not talk about the rights of Jewish people, which is highly alarming. Next slide, please. Okay, so this is just one of hundreds of examples of the attitude of the UN, not only treaty bodies, but also other bodies, like here, the example of General Assembly and the resolutions condemning particular states for their human rights record and violations. So it's unbelievable. We have 112 resolutions directed against Israel, 5 resolutions directed against Iran, North Korea, 6 resolutions, Syria, where the greatest violations of human rights are taking place constantly, 8 resolutions, etc., etc. We have Turkey, 0, United States, 7, a lot, but then we have China, 0. It looks like a joke, but this is actually a political reality, but also legal reality. This political reality translates, unfortunately, into legal reality, as the resolutions are binding instruments of international human rights law. Of course, with this, as in this example of General Assembly, with a very strong political agenda and political character, but still, these are official documents of the United Nations. The same United Nations that Kofi Annan announced as also the organization that whose role is to protect Jewish people from anti-Semitism and hatred. And here, of course, the argument can be raised that these are resolutions directed against Israel and not the Jewish people. But how these narratives look like in the General Assembly and other bodies of the UN, everyone who gets interested in this issue will find out just after 10 minutes of listening to one of the sessions of the Human Rights Council or other treaty bodies, perhaps not so much the Committee on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination, but other treaty bodies as well. UN Watch is the organization that actually watches the conduct of UN when it comes to anti-Semitic incidents, anti-Semitic speech, etc., and the attitude against Israel, openly hostile to Israel. So it's highly recommended to look at their webpage and the results of their research and their monitoring work they are doing. Can we get to the next slide, please? Thank you. So these are well, yes, these are examples that can be, to some, perhaps they may sound even funny, but I think that they are very telling. These are the examples of how how the attempts look like to deprive anti-Semitism of its true meaning. And of course, one can say that these are just some remarks given by the representatives of particular states known for their anti-Israeli and anti-Semitic attitudes, etc., etc. But this is actually powerful when such statements and such arguments appear on a regular basis. Then really this shift in understanding anti-Semitism is being deepened by such attitude, and within these discussions, the real danger and essence of anti-Semitism is being missed. So I wouldn't ignore also these manifestations of actually anti-Semitism. So here the representatives of the states actually claim that the very notion of anti-Semitism was captured by Jews, and that they should not be allowed actually to abuse this notion, this term of anti-Semitism, as there are other Semites and other nations that are real, true victims of anti-Semitism. So this is just one of numerous examples of the behavior of states at the UN, but we have also numerous examples of the behavior of the UN itself. For example, with the behavior or the statements by UN special rapporteurs, some of them are openly anti-Semitic, so their work cannot be considered in any way an element of the fight of anti-Semitism that UN is obliged to take. The next slide, please. Thank you. So here is this famous, some quotes from this famous report by the Special Rapporteur on freedom of religion or belief. And actually, we are all those who are engaged in research on fighting anti-Semitism within international human rights law. We were actually celebrating for long weeks or months this report, as this is actually one of, I don't know, perhaps 5 such documents in the last 20 years that are so openly honest and so openly address the issue of anti-Semitism. So it should be really praised. Some call it even a historic report on anti-Semitism. The question remains, of course, what came out of, what results came out of this report? Was it just a single, expression of courage of Mr. Shahid? Because we should see it in this way, actually, that this was very courageous of him to issue such a report within UN environment. But actually, were there any conclusions drawn from his findings? What did UN do in the sense of fighting anti-Semitism according to the remarks of Mr. Shahid? That would be interesting to follow. If anything has changed, if anything has been initiated, any any actions by the UN or by the member states that are also not mentioned in this report, because this is the only sense of drafting such reports, that something changes. So I think that we should be monitoring also these positive examples of the behavior of UN representatives and UN bodies. The next slide, I'm just checking. Yeah, I should be. Yes, so I would address now the issue of BDS as I see it. This is a systemic violation of human rights law, of the international human rights law, on many different levels, in many different respects. I think that these persons who experience BDS, who are the victims of BDS, they, as I put it here, experience discrimination, persecution, exclusion, intimidation. And by BDS actions, prohibitions on hate speech are breached, and often boycott actions have the character of incitement to hatred. So these are not just singular individual actions of BDS that violate or may violate human rights of an individual or a whole group, but for me, BDS as a phenomenon constitutes the violation of international human rights law, and it should be seen as such. Of course, not in all of its forms and expressions, but in most of them, I would see such violations, and I would really encourage also law enforcement agencies, etc., to look at the BDS also from this point of view as a violation of human rights. Can we get to the next slide, please? So just to bring this observation on the violation of human rights into practical, on the practical level, there exists a European Court of Human Rights in Strasbourg, which is a body of the Council of Europe, so the organization that also was created on the ashes of the Holocaust, and was created in order to protect human rights, to guarantee human rights. So this judicial body of the Council of Europe, the European Court of Human Rights, spoke on BDS in its judgment twice so far. So the first judgment was a judgment in Willem versus France in 2009. And I put here on the slide some basic facts concerning this case. So the European Court of Human Rights actually decides if the articles of the European Convention on Human Rights were violated. So here we have Mr. Willem, who claimed in front of the European Court that his right to free speech was violated because he was punished by his home country, France, by the French courts for his action within this BDS agenda. So he announced actually that the municipal catering services for which he was responsible or he was in charge of will boycott Israeli products to protest against anti-Palestinian policies of the state of Israel, of the government of Israel. So he was sentenced on appeal and fined with 1,000 euros. And the next appeal was unsuccessful, so he decided to go to the European Court of Human Rights and claim that his free speech right was violated by this decision of the French court. And the European Court of next slide, please, of Human Rights here actually, and in my opinion, did the good thing, because it said that in this case, there was no violation of the rights of Mr. Willem, because he was actually inciting to commission of a discriminatory act, that he was acting in his official capacity, and he was not allowed to announce such a boycott action, because his action was actually discriminatory. And as the court said in its conclusions, his intentions, or Willem's intentions, may have been to protest against the policy of Israel's prime minister, but the reasons given for the boycott were discriminatory and therefore reprehensible. So here the European Court of Human Rights found no violation of the rights of someone who promoted BDS. Can we go to the next slide, please? And this is what happened in 2020. And to be clear, I do not claim that the European Court of Human Rights became a part of this anti-Semitic BDS agenda, or actually also shares this attitude of capturing the notion of anti-Semitism and human rights in general in order to exclude the fight against anti-Semitism from the human rights dialogue or narratives. But I think it's also telling that the judgment in another BDS case is quite different this time. So the only difference actually in the behavior here is that it was not a person acting in official capacity as a mayor of a town who was boycotting or calling for a boycott of products from Israel, but this was just a group of citizens who did such an action in hypermarket to stop the customers from buying products coming from Israel. And they were also punished by national courts. Can we go to the next slide? And this is what the court said this time. The court found the violation of their rights and stressed that that they were not making any racist or anti-Semitic remarks during the action of boycotting, that they raised the subject matter of public interest. So their freedom of speech was within this general discussion on important public matter. And what the court also said is that incitement to differential treatment is not necessarily the same as incitement to discrimination. I think it's a very problematic statement in the context of BDS and actions against Israel, but generally these are actions not only against Israel, but they concern also every Jewish person who feels connected to the state of Israel, or is actually being forced by others to feel connected to the state of Israel by stressing the fact that he or she is Jewish. So just the next slide. I put here, yes, so just to summarize these differences in the attitude of the European Court of Human Rights in 2009 and in 2020 between these two cases. And the only element that actually I can agree with is this element of, in Willem, the person acting as a public official. Still, I think it's problematic and dangerous that the European Court of Human Rights didn't notice this discriminatory treatment in the actions of the applicants in Baldassi case, so in the second case from 2020. Okay, and the last slide, please, with perhaps some summary and ideas for solutions, even though they are really the most difficult ones, or perhaps they are not the most difficult ones. Their implementation is the most difficult aspect in our struggle against anti-Semitism. So why it all happened? I think Professor Cotler already addressed these issues in a far more better way than I do. But I think that there are a lot of elements actually combined, which make it much easier now to delete anti-Semitism from human rights agenda. And I would concentrate, because you are all aware of them, of all these points I point out here too, but the weak response is something I would like to stress. I do not see the massive actions or even scholarly actions by the academia, international academia, in defense of still keeping a fight against anti-Semitism within human rights, international human rights law agenda. I do not see a proper response also concerning this incredible rise of anti-Semitism in internet. Here we need new instruments of international human rights law to tackle this problem, because the instruments we are now having at hand concerning fighting hate speech, anti-Semitic hate speech, anti-Semitic hate crime are simply not enough to fight online anti-Semitism. So here, for sure, new instruments are highly needed. And yes, searching for solutions. As a lawyer who also litigates, as a litigator in many cases concerning anti-Semitism, Holocaust distortion, etc., etc., I think that public interest strategic litigation, both on national and international level, is one of the key elements, because this is actually the power of law. When the law in action, law in courts, when we win cases concerning anti-Semitism. I think this is important not only on the level of the victims' rights, but also on the symbolic level of fighting back with the use of law. And then bringing back and effectively promoting the true story of human rights. Perhaps we should get back to the very origins, to these quotes from Kofi Annan and Mr. Kruger from the Council of Europe, and keep repeating this and keep reminding people who perhaps do not remember because they are too young also, how did it happen that actually the international human rights law was created and implemented. Finding new allies, I think this is also crucial in in our fight against anti-Semitism. It cannot be Canada itself all the time. It's wonderful that it is this way, but we absolutely need new allies. PR actions on all possible levels and in all possible forms. And also investing in research on anti-Semitism and methodologies of measuring effectiveness of tools used against it. Because we still, I have the impression, do not know exactly what works and what is most effective and why it's most effective. There are no comprehensive reports. There are hundreds of reports that tackle particular issues, but perhaps we need something more general to be created so that we know where to go next. And I will stop here. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Alex, for sharing your very important perspective and your vital work. So it's really an honor for both of you to be here. I'm going to ask the first question, if that's okay, and I'm going to aim it at first to Irwin, and then Alex, if you want to follow up, please feel free. So Irwin, you outline an ambitious and a very important, and if not crucial, steps to begin to confront anti-Semitism as forms of action, not just talk, which is essential. But I want to present something to you, and I don't want to sound like a pessimist, but we've just been here for 4 days hearing analysis of all types of anti-Semitism. And one of the things that David Hirsch said that really resonated was that anti-Semitism is the only form of hate that's not acknowledged. And I think it's especially so in academia. The discourse of Jews being, white and the epitome of white elitism and colonialism and supporting the apartheid entity of Israel is very much part of the landscape of the top universities in Europe and North America. So that discourse goes on. In fact, yesterday, a very important book that ISGAP is going to put out in the near future, in the next month or so, on anti-Semitism in the United States was rejected by, I'll say it, by Rutledge, because some of the articles that deal with the IRA definition does not address or adopt the Jerusalem Declaration in the discourse in the articles, and therefore it's been labeled polemical and advocacy and not scholarship. So that's part of the issues that we're confronting in academia. So the Jerusalem Declaration is now the hook that the anti-Zionists will use to undermine the struggle against anti-Semitism and undermine the IRA definition that's so important in the struggle against anti-Semitism. So we have this discourse. You outlined how students are being affected by this. The work of ISGAP shows how the Muslim Brotherhood is funding American universities and British universities, using soft power to promote its ideology. Students for Justice in Palestine fighting kids physically on campus, making their lives miserable. During the Hamas war, we saw the streets were mobilized. So there's this intellectual environment in the universities and in the media of record that's very antagonistic to the Jewish community and to Israel. And then you have almost these shock troops of marginalized young Muslim kids that are being empowered by the liberal discourse, but also empowered by some of the more reactionary elements in their communities. So there's street violence now. So on the one hand, the academy is not acknowledging, as it should, the urgency of anti-Semitism and the need to confront it. If, I'm reading the headlines now, as I'm sure you are, there were missiles coming in from Lebanon again, and, it's becoming a bit of a trend in the last month or so. Hezbollah is entrenched in Lebanon. During the Hamas war, you have Iran playing a role in the kinetic theater, and the Qataris, the Muslim Brotherhood, funding the Hamas war, through our research, we now know that the Qatari Foundation was employed 13 major PR firms in Washington during the war with Hamas, affecting the discourse in social media. If Iran is 10 weeks away from breaking out as a nuclear power, if there's a confrontation again in the region in the next short time between Hamas, Hezbollah, Iran, I think the backlash against Israel and the Jewish community is going to be severe. We had a taste of it in May. If there's another conflict, I think there'll be another explosion of anti-Semitism globally. How do we, in this environment that is, anti-Semitism is growing exponentially. It's not a linear increase. It's gaining traction and moving rapidly. How do we implement the program that you outlined that is essential and insightful? And I agree with everything you've said. How do we implement action plans with a sense of urgency that will really make a difference in this, I don't know, explosive environment in which we're functioning now? Sorry, Irwin, you're muted.
I think we need to get out of the docket of the accused in which we have been almost institutionally implanted and begin to become the plaintiff, the claimant. In fact, unmasking, exposing, and calling out this anti-Semitism, old news. I mentioned, as I said, not just as being a threat to Jews, and not just as a threat to our common humanity, but a threat to the self-interest of all these community of democracies, because, as Ahmed Shahid has repeatedly reminded us, that it is toxic to democracies. And I think a number of things that I didn't mention that I might even reference now. The first thing is there have been very important parliamentary principles and precedents that we can invoke, in which parliamentarians, from the community of democracies have signed onto. I'm referring here to the London Declaration to Combat Anti-Semitism and the Ottawa Protocol to Combat Anti-Semitism, both of which were adopted in 2009, 2010, respectively, on the road to the unanimous adoption of the IRA definition in 2016. Those parliamentary antecedents expressly incorporate the language that then became part of the IRA working definition on anti-Semitism. So to say that the Jerusalem Declaration provides an alternative is either to be uninformed, misinformed, and misinforming, and in effect to turn history and law on its head. Because, as I said, what makes the IRA definition distinguishable is its democratic process of adoption over a 15 year period, and where the IRA definition, and I think here too, not only, as I said, anchored in parliamentary principles and precedents, as I mentioned, but anchored in equality law, in human rights law, and indeed in our international obligation, as Ahmed Shahid has put it, to prohibit incitement to hostility, discrimination, and violence. So IRA is an incorporation of human rights law and equality rights law. Let me just say, in terms of equality rights law, and this will lead up to the IRA definition itself, and that is that traditional anti-Semitism is a discrimination against denial of, assault upon the rights of Jews to live as equal members in whatever society they inhabit. The new anti-Semitism is a discrimination against the denial of, assault upon the rights of Israel and the Jewish people to live as an equal member of the family of nations. What is common to both forms of anti-Semitism, old and new, is discrimination. All that has happened is moved to discrimination against the Jews as individuals, to the discrimination against Jews as people, and reverting back to the discrimination of Jews as individuals. And this is what the IRA definition is anchored in. It's anchored in these human rights principles. And in fact, in the parliamentary precedents that I mentioned, in 2015, a very important parliamentary resolution was adopted by the Canadian Parliament, which, apart from referencing what also then became IRA, called upon the Canadian government to make the priority, to make the combating of anti-Semitism a priority in both our domestic and foreign policy. And that's the nature of the framing that has to be made in that regard. You know, you mentioned Iran, and I'll close with this, because as we meet today, President Raisi, the architect of the repression in Iran, takes office as the president of Iran. The person who was a member of the Death Commission in Iran in 1988 was responsible for the execution of thousands of Iranian dissidents, and who then afterwards, as prosecutor and attorney general, presided over the fact that Iran had the largest per capita execution of innocents of any country in the world. This is the person not only who today becomes president of Iran, but where European representatives and others are actually attending the fact that he's to be inaugurated as president of Iran. So this culture of appeasement has to, in fact, be itself exposed and unmasked. And we have to call upon the community of democracies to adhere to the very principles and precedents of a parliamentary nature, of IRA, of international human rights law, as Alex has mentioned so compellingly, to adhere to the very truths that underpin the struggle against anti-Semitism, and that therefore allyship should be a natural phenomenon of the community of democracies coming together in that regard, and not finding a situation where homage is paid to the architect of the repression of Iran.
So I've been trying not to take up too much time and space in the Q&A. I'm trying to get everybody involved, but I want to just pick up on that and then let Alex make a comment as well. You spoke about institutional anti-Semitism. What happens if the European countries led by the Biden administration actually re-enter into an agreement with Iran? And this agreement, if it will take place, and we don't know for sure if it will or not, but I understand that if there is an agreement, the West is going to give and open up at least tens of billions of dollars in cash to the regime. If the Western countries, if the United States is giving credibility and bringing Iran back into the family of nations and ending sanctions and giving them billions of dollars that we know will be used to support terrorism in Lebanon, in Yemen, in Syria, in Iraq, and perhaps beyond. Is this a form of institutional anti-Semitism? Is this something that the Jewish communities of the world and people who care about human rights can tolerate? Is this an expression of anti-Semitism in that the West would be supporting a regime that calls for the annihilation of a group of people, in this case, Jews? never mind its treatment of women, of gay people, of Yazdis, of Kurds, of others. What are the implications in the struggle against anti-Semitism if the West really does do this deal?
I think that we've got to be very careful in the manner in which we use the term anti-Semitism, because if we use it in a way too broadly, in other words, the fact that countries may be making a terrible mistake does not necessarily mean that that mistake was motivated by anti-Semitism. And I think sometimes if you begin that way, you may lose people who could be part of the allyship. And I think part of the problem also is focusing only on the nuclear threat. There is at this point, represented by Iran, a six-fold threat. And I think if we want to convey to the Americans and the Europeans the deadly nature of what's happening here, we have to identify the six-fold threat. And I'll do it just in not only one-liners, but almost in words. Number one, you have the nuclear threat, but you also have the terrorist threat of Iran as a leading state sponsor of international terrorism. You have the hegemonic threat, which we know about. You have the genocidal incitement threat. It's against the Baha'is as well as against the Jews. You have, and this is the fifth and the most important, massive domestic repression that is targeting all those communities and values that the US and the Europeans and the community of democracies claim to be protecting and defending. I'm referring here to the massive repression of women, to the arrests and persecution and prosecution of environmentalists, to the imprisonment of journalists, to the religious persecution and the like. It's not just anti-Semitic. All these values here are being, in fact, mortgaged and breached. And finally, you have, and this was very recently, transnational repression, where the US, where Iran sought to abduct and kidnap and return to Iran an American Iranian journalist, Masih Alinejad, and where the US Department of Justice in its unsealed information showed that there were 3 Canadians also that were threatened in that regard. In other words, you have the phenomenon of transnational repression. So you have all of these, what I would call critical mass of violations by Iran. And that's what we should be focusing on in a collective way, because if we just single out anti-Semitism, I think we're going to lose those that we need as allies, and some people may stop listening because they don't yet know what anti-Semitism is all about. We have to, in fact, unmask and expose the enormous international assault by Iran on all the values, human rights, institutions, laws, etc., that I mentioned, and that way embarrass the international community to be lifting sanctions at a time of such enormous international criminalization of rights.
Okay, thank you, Irwin. Thank you, Alex.
Just very briefly, I fully agree. Professor Cotler mentioned 6 of these elements. So there should be an international campaign actually focusing on all of them. On the side note, it's extremely depressing and sad that we actually have to undertake such effort to explain things that should be known or should be obvious to every, at least European state. All European states except Belarus are within the Council of Europe, the Council of Human Rights. So the fact that we even have to think about what will happen if they will join possibly US in the getting back to the talks and supporting Iran is devastating concerning the whole movement and idea of human rights protection. And this what you said about the publishing house you mentioned that rejected the book. I think it's highly alarming, because I cannot imagine any publishing house of this rank that would deny the book concerning, I don't know, the feminist rights, etc., women rights, which is in itself a part of activism in a sense, because it has to be like this. Human rights and the research on human rights in the scholarly sense goes hand in hand with activism on all major human rights issues. This is only this way that we manage to achieve any progress. So, so this is what is extremely worrisome.
I should say we have another very good publisher that is willing to publish it, so it's
This
okay.
is fine, but
yeah.
still.
Yeah. Okay, so I see Shai has a question, and please raise your electronic virtual hands if you have any questions. I can see it. Go ahead, Shai.
All right, thank you so much. Thank you, Professor Cotler, which I have the pleasure to had a few conferences with you in Israel in the past. And thank you for Professor Grabias for the lecture. And as you said, depression is something that keeps going and coming back here for the last few days. And I feel that the mind opening became to be with the same level with my depression. So I don't know, I'm happy that I've learned so much more, but I also realized that if we try as scholars to measure where does this huge battlefield is going to, we can all agree, I assume, that we are moving into a bad direction. I don't want to say we're losing the battle, but at the moment, August 2021, right? It's a multi-dimensional normalization of anti-Semitism, by all means. And my question for Professor Cotler and Professor Grabias from the lawfare aspect, where do you see the role of the state of Israel comes in with this huge vacuum of disability? Where do you see Israel as a state, as a sovereign state? Thank you.
Thank you. So, Irwin, do you want to address that, or?
Okay, I think, you know, Israel clearly is a principal actor, not only because it is, as a Jewish state, the target of the old new anti-Semitism, but because it has a principal role and responsibility in that regard. Let me just say, and I think it's not only true of the state of Israel, but all of us involved in this effort, that we have to begin to reframe the manner in which Israel is being perceived. As I said, get out of the docket of the accused, and three things. Number one, and I'm using now human rights language, but that's a language that has to be used, because that is the battlefield in which this language is itself being instrumentalized. And the first thing is we have to make it clear that the Jewish people is a prototypical indigenous people, that Zionism is a prototypical movement for national liberation and for the movement for the self-determination of this indigenous people. In other words, that the Jewish people are almost the only people that still inhabit the same land, embrace the same religion, study the same indigenous Bible, speak the same indigenous language, Hebrew, and bear the same indigenous name, Israel, as we did 3,500 years ago. In other words, the Jewish people as a prototypical indigenous people, that in order to combat this whole notion of, apart from the delegitimization, demonization, double standard, etc., the denialism with respect to that indigeneity. The second thing is, it's not only a prototypical indigenous people, but the Jewish people's national liberation movement is a prototypical anti-colonial movement. From Rome, Babylon to the present day, and I don't have to go through the history of persecution, displacement, dispossession, we are a prototypical anti-colonial people. And this too has to be emphasized. And the third thing, again, to combat those stereotypes, and this is what has to be affirmed, is the notion that Israel, the Jewish state, is a prototypical multi-racial, multi-ethnic, multi-religious, multilingual, multicultural democracy. And this is something too that needs to be properly and effectively framed. And I'll close just with one other thing, is that Israel also has to be at the table, sometimes by being absent at the international table where decisions are made. It thereby invites the kind of exclusion and discrimination unwittingly. I'll give you just one example. During the recent Hamas-Israel war, if you remember, there was a certain tipping point in the attitudes of the democracies with respect to Israel in that war. And that came on the occasion of the bombing of the media center in Gaza. Now, I'm not going into whether the media center should or should not have been bombed. I'm just saying that if you look at the responses of the US and Canada, the UK and the like, that was a tipping point. Why was that a tipping point? Because 2 years ago, and this is something that is not as well known as it deserves to be, but it provides, I think, a backdrop to the question and to the framing and to the action. 2 years ago, Canada and the United Kingdom founded the first World Press Freedom Forum. There was a gathering of 1,000 journalists, parliamentarians, and the like in London for that purpose. I was present. Who were not present? Israel, neither in its journalists or parliamentarians, in part because Israel was preoccupied and continued to be preoccupied with domestic aspects, one election after another and the like. So they weren't part of that conversation, but it got worse. At that conference, there was established an international media freedom coalition, of which there are now 44 members of the community of democracies. Who is not a member? Israel. I can tell you from my own conversations that they don't even know that, in fact, the Media Freedom Coalition was, in fact, established. But that Media Freedom Coalition undertook 2 pledges, not only the protection of media freedom, but protecting the safety and security of journalists, those who were the leaders in the establishment of that Media Freedom Coalition. You know, Canada, the UK, the US, that's where you saw the change in their attitude on the bombing of the media freedom. I'm not saying that if Israel had been a member of the Media Freedom Coalition, it would not have bombed the center, etc. There may have been the same strategic security reasons, but it would have at least factored those issues into account, and it would have given the reasons for bombing when it needed to be given, and not have Canada and the US and say, hey, you still haven't told us why you did this, long after, in fact, it was done. So Israel needs to be at the table, and it needs, and I'll close it, to appoint a special envoy for the combating of anti-Semitism. Why is it that many of the community of democracies have such special envoys? I happen to be the one from Canada, but I mean, you know, the United States just appointed out Deborah Lipsetz, the European countries have. Israel's not at the table when
Exactly.
are discussed, and that's something that I think has to be addressed and rectified.
Thank you. Alex, any comments, or should we have?
No, just perhaps in a slight defense of the state of Israel. I think that after so many decades of being attacked for actually everything what they have been doing, perhaps this is also one of the reasons that they said enough, and we are not getting into any of such initiatives or bodies, because we will be hated and discriminated anyhow. But this is just perhaps to see some reasons why Israel, as Professor Cotler rightfully noted, is absent. And I fully support the idea of creating a national envoy in Israel. It would be a powerful sign of perhaps getting back to the discussion and fighting back the anti-Semitism that is growing so rapidly.
Okay, thank you. Christine,
Yes,
please speak loud because it's coming through this thing.
this is for any of the speakers. The comment about the Canadian government combating the 3Ds, and that it's a priority for that government, both domestically and globally. Which other governments have made that statement or similar to that? And where do they, is there already in place any kind of getting together of those? Because each individual thing by itself doesn't have the kind of potential for success with that when they stand alone. So I'd like to know what your comments are.
So who should, either
I
one?
said to either.
So Alex, go ahead.
I don't know. So, well, I know some actions by particular states. I know that Germany is very active in many actions concerning anti-Semitism, but I haven't heard about such a huge scale of engagement as it's the case with Canada. I can only give you some very negative examples of states like my own that will not engage in any of this because actually they are at least partly involved in promoting anti-Semitism. So, or allowing anti-Semitism to be spread widely. So any other country that Germany comes to my mind, actually. There are many actions on national levels by particular states, but not to the degree or scale that would be so important as it is in case of Canada. But perhaps Professor Cotler will know better.
Okay, I just on a number of things. Number one is the IRA itself, the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance. It holds 2 plenaries a year, just had one in Athens virtual, the next one in Thessaloniki, which is to be held in November. But on the last one in May, it occurred at the time of the Israel-Hamas war and in a little noticed condemnation, but the IRA body unanimously adopted a declaration condemning both the alarming increase in anti-Semitic hate crimes, as I mentioned, and in particular, the incendiary hate speech. I should mention that 30 countries have already adopted the IRA working definition on anti-Semitism, and we should make it as an objective to get more countries, not only to adopt it, adoption is one thing, implementation is another, and that's what's really important, implementing the IRA working definition across government, parliament, law enforcement systems, universities, education, and the like. We need to, in fact, institutionalize the implementation of the IRA definition. And understandably, because IRA grew out of the Stockholm Declaration in the year 2000, but it is largely Eurocentric, and we need to get more countries outside of Europe to adopt. It was encouraging to see that Bahrain became the first of the Abraham Accord countries to adopt it. But we need to get, as I say, more adoptions in Africa, in Asia, in Latin America. We need to globalize the adoption and implementation of IRA. Second, I mentioned Malmo coming up, Malmo, Sweden. Countries are supposed to come to Malmo with pledges for action to combat anti-Semitism. So Alex, this will be a litmus test to see what countries will in fact produce what action plans that they should be in fact undertaking. And the third is more countries, and within the IRA framework, we are seeing are in fact beginning to adopt national action plans to combat anti-Semitism. I'm referring, for example, to the Netherlands and other countries in Germany, etc., which are working now on the adoption and implementation of those action plans. But we need to hold this out to be an objective with respect to the community of democracies and international community as a whole. And this has to include as well the United Nations and its institutions. We did, and I have to credit Ahmed Shahid at this, have a meeting under the auspices of the UN point person for combating anti-Semitism, Moratinos, and almost all of the special envoys were present, and we discussed the whole question of anti-Semitism within the UN, its institutions, and the like. And this is a crucial component of combating of anti-Semitism, as I say, to combat the laundering of anti-Semitism under universal public values. Let me give you just one outrageous example, which arose right out of Durban and the legacy of Durban. And that is in the history of the Geneva Convention, which is the body with the framework for international humanitarian law, the contracting parties to the Geneva Convention put one state in the docket of the accused with respect to international humanitarian law violations. On all three occasions when they convened for that purpose, that state was Israel. Not China, not Syria, not Russia, as Alex mentioned with regard to the UN General Assembly resolutions, but astonishingly, with regard to violations of international humanitarian law, the only state ever indicted for that purpose has been the state of Israel. I can give many other examples, but my whole point here is to say that we have to unmask, expose, and reverse what is happening in the international arena, because that is corrupting human rights, undermining international law, eroding the credibility of the UN, and in fact, as I said, and the worst thing is the manner in which it is shaming the real struggle against racism.
And my just final quick comment is that your commentary regarding the prototypical indigenous comments that you made were just phenomenally helpful. So thank you.
Yeah, I agree. It's very important, very powerful argument. Andreas.
Yeah, thank you. One short but perhaps difficult question I would have for both of you is, how do you explain the passivity of the European countries regarding Iran?
I will give floor to Professor Cotler as an expert in this, but I can see only political aspects and very cynical ones too. Not so much ideological, at least when it comes to the EU member states. That would be my response.
Yeah.
It's a manifestation really of the culture of appeasement, and it's anchored also in what some of the European countries consider to be, trade, economic, political interests, and the like. But it's undermining their own self-interest, and it's undermining the whole struggle for human rights as a whole. And it's shameful, in fact, in the way in which they have appeased Iran. And this has been going on for some time. It only gets worse.
Okay, thank you. Are there any other comments or questions? Please raise your hand. Shai, you have a follow-up? Go ahead. Unmute yourself.
Yes, I have a very quick follow-up. And I believe that my decades that I spent in the Israeli government trying to fight against the anti-Semitism, the new one, the legitimization, the BDS, and so on and so forth, and now brought me to try to find an answer in academia, and I'm still depressed. Brings me maybe to follow up and maybe re-ask again, Professor Cotler. We know that those non-state global initiatives that tremendous people as you and your colleagues have been done for Israel at the moment maybe needs to have a support from the state of Israel, because that we're dealing here with a formal institution like the United Nations, like any other official gathering that requires a state answer. And the only state that can actually do that is Israel. And I believe this is my criticism toward my own country, which I'm talking from, that I believe that since its establishment, since 1948, I'm not so sure we had the right answer for this enormous multi-dimensional challenge. So I'm still depressed.
One way not to be depressed is to look at the long arc of history. I do believe that ultimately it bends towards justice. It's just that we have to go through a number of painful experiences along the way. But in the long run, and because I look at the history of the Jewish people in the long run, I'm optimistic. But in terms of the specifics that you mentioned, I still want to devolve more responsibility on the community of democracies, whether we talk about the EU and the like. They're the ones that have to take the lead. There's only so much that the state of Israel can do. And in fact, when it comes to doing those things, it in fact is often excluded, as Alex mentioned, from the very arenas in which the action has to be taken. So as I say, I think we need to get out of the docket of the accused, and not so much only on behalf of Israel, but on behalf of all the common values that we claim to be upholding as part of the community of democracies. The community of democracies have to be held to account as well at this point, with respect to the implementation and indeed taking the leadership with regard to the promotion and protection of international human rights, and within that, the combating of anti-Semitism as a threat, as I said, to our common humanity.
I just can say that this pessimism comes also from the huge challenge of Israeli scholars and Israelis in a very high rank and that holds lots of reputation around the world. While, for example, the German Bundestag parliament is confirming a resolution that the BDS is not such a good idea to conduct in Germany because of the history and because, so while people like you, Professor Cotler, are fighting for Israel, people from Israel sending letters to the Bundestag telling them, please do not forbid the BDS in Germany because it's a type of self-expression to the Palestinians. So what I'm trying to say that the challenge is multidimensional, both from domestic aspects from Israel and also from institutional aspects, because sometimes you need to have a states beyond your global initiative. So what I'm trying to say that if we as a scholars trying to measure our efficiency and productiveness, I believe that we need to find new answers outside of the box. And sorry for being pessimistic again.
Well, there's optimism if we're trying to find new solutions. So maybe you make an optimistic point. Okay. Anybody else? We're a bit over time. Okay, so we've gone a bit over time. So Irwin and Alex, thank you so much for your efforts and your work, and thank you for being here today and continued strength and success in your vital efforts. So thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Charles, for your leadership here.
Thank you. We look to you for the leadership. So thank you. So we're going to take